Welcome to Classical Poets Live. I'm your host, Andrew Benson Brown, representing the Society of Classical Poets. I am taking a different track with this episode. I am not going to interview anybody, nor even rant about the problems of the contemporary poetry world, which are legion, but I'm not going to focus on that at least directly in this episode. What I want to do instead, I'm going to spend some time talking about one of the greatest books you've never heard of. Or if you have heard of it, you've probably heard of it only in passing and you don't know much about it. You may have even heard that this book is a bad book. And that book is Gerusalemme Liberata, The Liberation of Jerusalem. Or Jerusalem Delivered is another translation. But I like the Liberation of Jerusalem. The title is just, it's a little more grandiose. This was an epic poem written by Torquato Tasso. It is about the First Crusade. The Christians are the good guys, the Muslims are the bad guys, and just by me giving that briefest of synopses, you can probably guess why you've never heard of it. Because you're really not allowed to write something like that from the kind of good versus evil clash of cultures perspective today. We are living in a diverse world where there are no bad foreigners, and no human being is illegal. Or so we're told. But I'm not just saying that this is one of the greatest books ever, because I like the poem, which I do, but it was actually for a long time objectively considered by pretty much everybody in Europe to be one of the greatest books ever. And I want to explore how that is and why that is and who Tasso was, because he's a very interesting person. But first, I'm just going to start by diving into the poem itself a little bit and reading a few stanzas from the opening canto. Now, this is the Oxford World Classics edition I have. It was translated by Max Wickert. It is a recent-ish translation, 2009, so it's a new translation, basically. And I think it's the best one that's ever been done, because it's in ottava rima, and it rhymes, so you really get the feel and the suppleness of the original, in a way that was actually never really available to this degree until now. There was an Elizabethan translation translated by this poet Fairfax. I've read a lot of that one, and I thought that one was pretty good, but this one is the best. And I'm going to let you get a feel for this poem by just reading the first two stanzas here. I sing of war, of holy war, and him, captain, who freed the sepulchre of Christ. Greatly he wrought by force of mind and limb, and greatly suffered, nobly sacrificed. Vainly did hell oppose him, Asia grim vainly combined with Libya, hell enticed. Heaven favored him and guided back, to fight under his sacred flag, each errant knight. O Muse, not you who upon Helicon garland your brow with long since faded bays, but you who among heavenly choirs don your golden crown of deathless stars, always. Breathe in my breast celestial fire, shed on my song your light, and pardon if my lays, embroidering the truth, seem overgrown at times with pleasures other than your own. So, there's a number of things going on here, just starting with the second stanza rather than the first. It's interesting how Tasso appropriates the muse. He does not reference the classical muses of Greece, who upon Helicon garland their brows with long since faded bays. Instead, his muse is a Christian muse. You who among heavenly choirs don your golden crown of deathless stars always. This seems, just kind of like a small thing, but it's actually a very significant innovation in epic in this respect, because prior to this, the muse always referred to the pagan gods, not to Christianity. And if we move to the first stanza, the first two lines, I sing of war, of holy war, and him, captain, who freed the sepulchre of Christ. The first line refers to, of course, Virgil's Aeneid, which is typical of almost every great epic, but it also refers to Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, who Ariosto himself riffed on Virgil, but the way he did it was, the note in the back describes it, a mischievous elaboration. Ladies, knights, arms, loves, courtesies, and bold deeds, I sing. And then the captain who freed the sepulchre of Christ in the second line refers to the hero of the poem, who is Godfrey of Boulogne, the most popular leader of the First Crusade, and the man who is credited with capturing Jerusalem in 1099, and who was made the first ruler of that conquered city. Actually, although he died a year later, he didn't rule for very long. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and read a few more stanzas that pertain to this character. Said God unto his messenger, Go find Godfrey, and ask him in my name. What need for more delay? Why is the fight declined by which enslaved Jerusalem shall be freed? Let him call his chiefs to council, and remind the truants of their task, for he shall lead. I elect him here, on earth, through their election. They, once his peers, shall fight by his direction. He spoke, and eagerly did Gabriel speed to perform his bidding, and in air rendered his viewless spirit palpable, with mortal limbs and shape, of an age somewhere between boyhood and youth. Such human shell, but charged with awe and splendor everywhere, he made his own, and fixed upon his maze of golden curls a nimbus of white rays. White wings he donned with tips of gold, whose climb is indefatigably swift and sure, with which through winds and clouds he soared sublime above round earth's and ocean's curvature. So garbed, down from eternity to time, from purest regions to a world impure he swept, and first upon Mount Lebanon paused, balanced on extended wings. Then on, toward Tortosa's coast he veered in flight, precipitously down upon his embassy. Just then the sun was rising into sight, the face of dawn still half hid in the sea, while, offering up his customary rite, Godfrey was praying to the deity, when, by a second sun the light increased, and the angel rose before him from the east, saying to him, Godfrey, behold, the day of battle is at hand, the seasons mend. Why then this interval? Wherefore delay to free captive Jerusalem? Go send for all your chiefs in council, and inveigle the laggards to remember the great end. You hereby God ordains their leader, and freely they shall submit when you command. So if you noticed, we very quickly move beyond the mere historical account, and we go to heaven, and we see Gabriel delivering the message of this divine mission from the Almighty to Godfrey of Boulogne. Now, it has to be said, if you didn't already guess this, the poem is not very historically accurate, although in Tasso's defense, he was drawing on medieval chronicles to write this thing, especially the account of William of Tyre, a 12th century chronicler. They just weren't the most accurate accounts. So a historical fiction writer is really only as good as his sources. But beyond this, I would say that if you're really that concerned about accuracy, you might be one of those snobs who only reads nonfiction books. And you probably know the type. If you want to be factually accurate, just don't write historical fiction, because you need to embellish things to make them entertaining. My own view is that a good work of historical fiction should have a 60-40 ratio. That is, it's more than half accurate, maybe around 2/3 accurate, but when you go beyond that, 80% accurate, you're really straying into the territory of the thing that you're writing about is just becoming incredibly boring. So Tasso, like all great poets, was not concerned with recording just mere historical facts, although he was concerned with that, and did that to the best of his degree, really. More importantly, Tasso had a vision. And he alludes to this in the beginning of this poem, at the end of the second stanza that I read. He invokes the muse, he writes about embroidering the truth. And then in the third stanza, he continues that line of thought. You know how, where Parnassus most proffers its flattering sweets, the world flocks in delight. Yet how? By charming and mellifluous verse, truth has disposed the most depraved to write. As sometimes to a feverish child the nurse holds out a glass with sugared rim. Her sleight tricks him to drain the bitter draught. So stealth restores him, and delusion gives him health. So we see here that the theme of this stanza is pleasure, flattering sweets, delight, charming, mellifluous verse, and we end with the metaphor of the nurse sugaring the rim of the cup so the child can swallow the bitter medicine. So stealth restores him and delusion gives him health. So we see that part of artistic license is, in fact, deception, or as Dante memorably put it several centuries before Tasso, the poet tells beautiful lies. And so what are some of these beautiful lies in regards to Tasso's poem? Well, the most glaring is about the hero, Godfrey of Boulogne himself. Tasso paints him as being very wise and chivalric and noble, but in real life, he actually employed treachery to take Jerusalem. He did some, devious things, which Tasso describes not at all in the poem. He was heavily idealized. Now, to be fair, I think that Godfrey gets a little too much of a bad rap today, as many historical European figures do. There's this tendency, of course, to project our values onto the past and to just shake our finger at everybody. Celebrating the First Crusade is, of course, a big no-no today, because the Crusades were imperialistic and aggressive and about conquest. Now, the obvious response to this, which you're not allowed to say, is that the Muslims had been invading Europe for centuries before the Crusades and would continue to invade Europe for centuries after. And they only failed because of leaders like Charles the Hammer Martel and John Hunyadi. The Battle of Tours and the Siege of Belgrade were more than 700 years apart. And even after Belgrade, for centuries, the Ottoman Turks continued to invade. But the Crusades, the one time where the Europeans fought back, and the knights took the fight to the enemy's homeland. Now, Tasso's portrayal of Godfrey himself was very much, it should be said, the standard view of the time. From the time of Godfrey's death in 1100 to really just about 100 years ago, Godfrey was idealized to a very high degree. He was one of the 9 worthies, this elite pantheon of chivalric heroes, which was really a big deal because among the 9 worthies were also Julius Caesar, Alexander, Hector, King David, King Arthur, Charlemagne. So a very illustrious company that Godfrey keeps there. And most of the 9 worthies are still household names, unlike Godfrey, who, along with Tasso, has been kind of forgotten. In fact, you could ask the question, has Tasso been forgotten because Godfrey has been forgotten? Because the historical events Tasso wrote about have come into disrepute? Well, yes, partly, but it's also the case that the greatness and the fame of Tasso's poem was a huge boost to Godfrey's posthumous status as well, and that Tasso's status would have declined really no matter what the subject was. And we can say this because the same thing has basically happened to all the other Renaissance epics. Ludovico Ariosto and Edmund Spenser have also pretty much been tossed aside, and so has Camões. Camões was a Portuguese poet who wrote an epic about Vasco da Gama, the great explorer. And if you had to add a 4th great epic poet to the 16th century triumvirate of Tasso and Ariosto and Spenser, it would be Camões. And there were a lot more people writing in this genre than just these 4. Epic was the most prestigious genre, everybody did it. Hundreds of works, most of them not good, were produced. As will always be the case, of course, when a lot of people are doing the same thing. So they've all been forgotten, except in their own respective countries and languages. In the English-speaking world, Spenser is still highly regarded, even if I hardly ever meet anybody who's actually read The Faerie Queene. They still give Spenser lip service, at least. And likewise, in Italian and Portuguese, these other poets have some status. There's quite a bit of multimedia content about Tasso in the Italian language, whether it's on like YouTube or, audiobooks, but there's really no English language content that I've been able to find. So that's why I really wanted to talk about him, because he was so important for such a long time and nobody really ever talks about him today. Although, in fact, to this day, Sicilian puppet theaters are still performing plays that draw on Tasso's poem. But the poem just doesn't have the same international status that it once did. Now, partly this is because of the strangeness of Renaissance epics. They blend classical literature and myth with old French romances and Arthurian legends that were popular at the time. They're hybrid works that you don't really see in other places and times, although in many ways you could probably see Renaissance epics as the precursors to the modern fantasy novel. There's a lot of fantasy folklore, the medieval chivalry is mixed in with supernatural events, but the old epics themselves are no longer popular. And that is a great shame, because they are really, really great and very enjoyable reads. Tasso was basically like the J.K. Rowling or Stephen King of his time. He was universally read by educated people, universally known. In fact, the great French writer of the counter-revolutionary Romantic period, Chateaubriand, he has this great book he wrote called The Genius of Christianity. It is a 700-page masterpiece that is out of print, go figure, but during his lifetime, this was actually the thing Chateaubriand was really known for. And then when he died, his memoirs from Beyond the Tomb became the thing he was known for after his death. But anyway, Chateaubriand has a chapter in this book, The Genius of Christianity, about epics, and about how all the epic poems to have come along since classical times have been Christian Christian ones. Chateaubriand thought this was actually not accidental, it was a necessary criteria because epic just isn't possible without some dominant transcendental ethical system to undergird what it's about, that really provides the sense of universal values that epic needs if it's going to flourish in a culture. I think Chateaubriand is right about this. In this sense, the decline of epic could be taken to be a symptom of a civilization's sickness and corruption, since when epics go out of style, it's an indication that a society no longer has any universal values, and that it will soon tear itself apart, probably, as is happening in our own age. But the point of this digression is that Chateaubriand thought that there were only 3 poems written since antiquity that deserve to be accorded the title of epic, and those are the Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, of course, and the liberation of Jerusalem. So there you have it, the great Chateaubriand pronouncing his authority from beyond the tomb. Now, the Oxford World Classics edition of Liberation has an appendix, and the notes were done by Mark Davy, an Italian Renaissance scholar. Davy compiled a list of all the writers, poets, artists, and composers who adapted some part of the liberation of Jerusalem in their own work. And it's just 4 pages of names and dates of people who set Tasso to music or painted a scene or wrote something. Now, some of these names are recognizable: Spenser, Milton, Byron, Voltaire, Rousseau, Longfellow, Monteverdi, Handel, Salieri, Mozart's rival, interesting, Goethe. Now, largely most of these names and works have been forgotten, though I'm sure they were notable in their day. And Mark Davy actually tells us that of all post-medieval authors, only Shakespeare's collected works cast a longer shadow on music and painting. So if you were to rank the most influential Western authors of all time, in terms of just this metric of influencing future artists, composers, authors, etc., which is probably really the best and most objective measure of that vague and evanescent quality, greatness. Here's how it would go. This is just verifiable just in terms of citations. So we're going by just objective metrics here. Not saying who is the best in any kind of subjective sense or who you like. So number 1, Homer. No surprise there. Number 2, Virgil. 3, Ovid. 4, Dante. 5, Shakespeare. And 6th, Tasso. Although maybe those 4th, 5th, and 6th places could be switched around a little bit. Shakespeare, maybe he'll rank a little higher if you just take all of his collective works into consideration. Maybe even beyond Dante, I don't know. You could kind of debate that a little bit. But if we're just taking a single work into consideration, those 5th and 6th places could probably be reversed. Now, you'll notice a few things here. You will notice how the most influential writers in history are, without exception, all poets, not prose writers. If you were to add a 7th and 8th figure to this list, it would almost certainly be Milton and probably Ariosto, massively influential for hundreds of years like Tasso. Probably the only prose work that would be on this top 10 list is Don Quixote. This is not an accident. The novel is a very recent development. Epic was the genre for basically 3,000 years. So, if you only take one lesson away from this, it should be that prose is for dum-dums. And the number 2 thing you'll notice is that these figures are all narrative poets, not lyric poets. Although Virgil and Shakespeare also wrote lyric poetry, they wouldn't be as important if they'd only done that. The great narrative poets of their time and place all occupy, in fact, a slightly higher position than their contemporary lyric poets. In the pantheon of Latin poetry, for example, Horace is number 3, behind Ovid and Virgil. Likewise, Petrarch takes a backseat to Dante. Now, when I have this conversation with lyric poets, they tend to be very resentful of this, and I'm not saying that it's fair, I'm not saying that narrative poetry is better than lyric poetry or anything. Horace and Petrarch are still way higher status than most narrative poets who have lived. But if there's something this metric does demonstrate, it's that if you want average people to care about poetry, it must tell a story. And poetry today tends not to do that. So is it any surprise that people don't really care about poetry anymore? Now, back to the subject. Not only was Tasso's poem influential, his life was as well. There were a lot of artists who dramatized Tasso's biography. It was very colorful. Now, I haven't said anything really about who Tasso the man was, so here's a brief biography. Tasso's father, Bernardo Tasso was a courtier and a successful poet himself who also wrote an epic romance that was quite successful in his day. Bernardo was, one of these many hundreds of people writing narrative poems that have been forgotten. Although I guess in the case of Bernardo's poem, which is called Lamadigi or Lamadigi, I probably said that wrong, it was supposed to be pretty good. So because his father was a poet, Tasso got a head start. When he was 16 in 1559, he drafted his first stanzas of what would become the liberation of Jerusalem. The choice of his subject may have been inspired by personal experiences. A year earlier, Turkish pirates had raided his family's town of Sorrento and reportedly abducted his sister and brother-in-law. So whatever the reason for starting this epic, he started it, and for more than 2 decades, he labored on it. But he started to get distracted with other problems. It seems that when he was around 30 years old, he began showing symptoms of serious mental illness. The jealousies and rivalries of court life developed into a paranoia. He thought he was being poisoned. Compounding this was the fact that certain officials within the Catholic Church didn't like passages of his poems. They were considered not doctrinally orthodox enough, and Tasso began to fear that he would be denounced as a heretic to the Inquisition. Tasso had a difficult relationship with his patron, Alfonso II of the D'Este family. His paranoia really got on Alfonso's nerves, but he graciously put up with Tasso because he recognized his talent and because he wanted to be associated with the prestige of this great epic poem he was writing. So eventually Tasso ended up attacking a servant with a knife. He was placed in a madhouse. This was in 1579. And in the madhouse, he was able to work on his literary compositions. He wasn't confined very strictly a lot of the time if he wasn't having active symptoms. So when the liberation came out in 1581, it took Europe by storm. Its effects were very far-reaching, as I have elaborated already. And I'm guessing that fame probably didn't help his mental condition. Just thinking of celebrities today who are kind of unhinged by the constant attention they get. And when you're already mentally unbalanced to begin with, fame usually doesn't make that condition better. On top of that, Tasso never earned any money for his poem during his entire life, not a single penny. He had no control over the manuscript. There were no copyright laws or anything. Plus, he was locked up, which didn't help, and he remained confined for 7 years. Now, the cell where he was kept in St. Anna Hospital in Ferrara became a pilgrimage site for literary tourists after his death. Goethe and Byron both visited it and authored works about Tasso inspired by their experience. While that original cell no longer exists, another one has been erected on the site of it. Obviously, it's not used as a cell, it's a memorial, but you can visit it today if you ever find yourself in Ferrara. So Tasso was let out eventually. He moved to Mantua, then wandered around Italy for another decade. Then in 1594, Pope Clement VIII invited Tasso to Rome. There, he would ascend the Capitoline Hill and be crowned by the Pope. Now, Petrarch had been crowned with a laurel wreath on that very same hill about 250 years earlier, which, by the way, was the occasion where Petrarch officially announced the Renaissance had begun. So, you might think, well, Tasso, pretty nice being crowned on the Capitoline Hill, but Petrarch beat you to it. But no, you would be wrong to think that. Torquato Tasso was not scheduled to be crowned any mere poet laureate. Torquato Tasso was to be crowned with the title King of Poets. But as it happened, only a few days before he was to be crowned, Tasso traveled to a convent during a storm and died there. And since his death, no one else has been accorded that title. You can probably see why Tasso's life has been so frequently dramatized. It's not just about who he was, it's about what he represented. Tasso became the archetype of the mad poet, the man driven to insanity by his own genius who sacrificed everything for his art and was oppressed and misunderstood by his society. And in this respect, Tasso is to poets what Van Gogh is to painters. People, they tell stories about Van Gogh now, but before that they were telling stories about Tasso. Tasso was Van Gogh before Van Gogh. Now, I really haven't delved at all into the plot of the liberation of Jerusalem or any of the different characters beyond Godfrey himself, but the story is really great. It's beautifully written. There's a lot of great couplets that are couched in aphoristic form. From hateful day more hateful night is born, till yet more hateful daybreak greets the morn. And there are also a lot of exciting battle sequences that are very moving. Within the post-classical literary tradition, it is the best martial epic that has been written, really since the Aeneid. And one of my favorite scenes in this respect is in Canto 9, when the foe of the Christians, the Sultan Suleiman, raids the Crusader camp at night and catches everyone off guard. And he's wreaking havoc, and then this happens. Now from the boldest hearted left alive stepped forth Latinus, born by Tiber's side, whom neither hardship could of will deprive, nor years subdue or tame in strength and pride. His 5 sons, nearly of an age all 5, wherever he fought were always by his side, bearing more arms than years, of tender youth, their limbs still growing, chins and cheeks still smooth. So Latinus's 5 sons surround Solomon and attack him, and one by one they fall as their father looks on, until he is the last one, and he realizes that his noble line is now extinct. And here's what he does. Their father. Ah, no father now, alas, cruel fate to take at once so many sons. In their 5 deaths now sees as in a glass his own and all his noble lines at once. Was his old age so strong that in that mass of miseries, unbowed by such affronts, he could still breathe, still fight? But perhaps he his slain sons' deeds and faces did not see, and kindly darkness with her shadowing hood kept some of that dread vision from his eyes. Even so, unless he too were lost, all would seem lost to him, a triumph to despise. Prodigal of his own, for his foe's blood he with the greed of greediest miser vies. And it is moot that more would mollify his grief and rage, to kill him or to die. But thus he taunts his foe. Seems this my hand so much to be despised, so feeble, that with all its strength it cannot make you stand, to turn on me the fierceness of your hate? And strikes him with a stroke so bitter and so deadly that it tears through mail and plate, and finds his side and makes a huge wound there, while warm blood spurts and spreads along the tear. And at that taunt, that blow, the savage lord turns blade and rage against him straight, and mauls his cuirass, having smashed his shield, that board wound tight in 7 toughened ox-hide cauls, and in his bowels plunges his great sword. With a choking sob, wretched Latinus falls, and spills forth in an intermittent flood, now from the wound, now from his mouth, his blood. As on the Apennine a sturdy tree that scorns hot Eurus and harsh Aquilo, if a huge wind gust cracks it finally, makes nearby trees partake its overthrow, so he falls, and with such great fury he makes all who dare come close to him lie low. For a man so fierce, a worthy end it is, that, though he dies, he wreaks a ruin like this. So a very moving scene, I think. This poem gets a lot of flack for being kind of this, simple good and evil thing, but it is not nearly as simplistic as it is sometimes described as. Some of the heroes are problematic, and the Muslim antagonists, while they are villains, are given touches of humanity by Tasso. In fact, one of the most famous and moving passages of the poem is near the end when the Sultan Suleiman, the one who killed Latinus and his 5 sons, he's looking out on the final battle. And he realizes that his army is going to lose. And so this is how it's described. Now, while faithful and infidel forces draw together, making wounds and slaughter rife, fierce Solomon climbs his tower and in awe beholds, though from afar, their desperate strife. As on a stage or tourney ground, he saw the bitter tragedy of human life. Horrors of death, attack, retreat, advance, and the great game of destiny and chance. So Solomon puts on his armor and he charges into the fray, and he is killed, at least in the poem. In real life, that guy lived for another 8 years, but whatever, 60-40 ratio. So to conclude, what are we to make of Tasso and his poem? Has it been justly tossed onto the scrap heap of literary history? Of course, you know what I think. But if you have an opinion about this, please do leave a comment. I'd like to hear what you have to say. But here's my take. For more than 1,000 years, the threat of invasion from radical, militant Islam was ever present in the mind of every European, which is why Tasso's poem was so relevant for so long, and I would argue is still relevant today. even though we don't really want to admit that. Because if we look around, we are still being invaded, just not in a conventional military capacity yet. And if you think that radical Islam is no longer a threat and is just going to go away, I would point out that the Prophet Muhammad was a conqueror, after all. And peaceful Sufi mystics notwithstanding, there will always be believers who interpret the Quran as a call to jihad. And of course, what do the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan represent, if not a modern American crusade? Now, whatever your stance on that is. So I think it is high time that we revived Tasso from his relative obscurity, and that we take his lessons to heart. And even if Godfrey of Boulogne was not exactly the pious, idealistic figure that Tasso portrayed, the poet does present us with models of chivalry and piety to aspire to. And above all, I think it is time that we revived the title, King of Poets, which has languished in abeyance. It's been a vacant position ever since Tasso was unable to assume it. No one has ever been crowned King of Poets, or Queen of Poets for that matter. And it's high time we found someone worthy to represent classical literature once again. A diamond in the rough, so to speak, to thrust onto the world stage. Of course, this is really an essential part of achieving world poetical domination, because we will need a poet to lead us. Obviously, this will not be some measly one-year appointment. As with the current poet laureateship, it'll be a lifetime position. Of course, a king needs a crown, so we're going to need to find a good silversmith to make us one. So while you're waiting for my next episode to drop, you can accomplish that for me. Be sure to check out The Liberation of Jerusalem. One of the top critical comments of Wickert's translation on Amazon is that it's not as good a translation as some prose translation that this reviewer cited, because it's less literally accurate. Which, he's right about that. It's less literally accurate, but that's total nonsense. Do not ever let me catch you reading a prose translation of a work of classical poetry. I will not permit it among my subscribers. You are an elite group whom I hold to a certain standard. Reading prose translations of poetry is far too base of a practice. You're better than that. So don't do it, because you'll be cast out into the cold, cruel world. So that's my advice. Be on the lookout for the next king or queen of poets. Who knows where this unsung hero will be? They could be working at Walmart right now, stocking shelves. So while grocery shopping, you may have to peer beyond the uniform to see the true poet within. So until next time, be formal, stay classy. I'll see you then.